All right. Well, hello, Dr. Bahar Koymen. I'm really excited to see you today. This is the Psychophiles podcast, and I would just like to get right into it to get a sense of when you've gotten into developmental psychology, because you're a developmental psychologist, um, how did you make that kind of transition from, being a psychology student before and then going into that field? What is the kind of initial driver, the initial motivator for going into that?
Um, yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, first of all. So my background is a little interesting because I was born into graduate school, actually. My parents were doing their postgraduate studies in the US,
Oh,
and I was born into graduate school. And I remember having this conversation with my dad when I was 8 or something. And he told me that I should do a PhD, whatever I study. And he said, it doesn't matter if you want to be an academic or not. Just do your PhD, get it out of the way, and then you decide what you want to do. So,
yep.
for most people, it's the undergraduate degree that is the kind of final point. But
Yes,
for me, it was set as a PhD
absolutely. Yeah.
when I was, even without knowing what it was.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily enough, it turned out that that was what I wanted to do. Probably I was inspired by my parents as well. My mom was a professor of education.
Mm.
And all my life I lived on campuses, campus housing. And so that was the sort of my orientation, at least, to the academic world. But then I wanted to I was trying to decide what major I wanted to do. And then psychology was my first choice, mostly because I didn't want to do sort of more of the engineering side of things or like medical stuff or stuff. So I was more interested in social sciences, it was clear. And then I decided to study psychology.
Yeah.
As we all know, most people start studying psychology to become clinical psychologists because
Yep,
everybody
that's
think
right.
about clinical psychology or therapists and stuff like that when we say psychologists. But clinical psychology was really not my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized like how little research there was with children, and I love children. So I said, okay, let's try doing a master's with developmental psychology, and
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah.
But what was sort of a light bulb moment for me was my postdoc at Max Planck Institute in
Yep. Yep.
Leipzig,
Yep.
MPI for evolutionary anthropology, where I worked with Michael Tomasello and Elena Levin. And it changed my view on developmental psychology because developmental psychology isn't just looking at children or investigating how certain skills develop from infancy to adulthood, but it's more about investigating, how certain skills evolve in different timelines. So from infancy to adulthood, that's one timeline.
Mm-hmm.
But then, because that department was developmental and comparative psychology,
Yeah.
so we were also interested in looking at a different timeline, which is like what makes us uniquely human, how certain skills evolved across species. So that's a second timeline.
Yep.
And also, for instance, even when you're just looking at, like human species or how certain skills develop from infancy to adulthood, why do we have this skill to begin with, and why do we look at this? So, for instance, one focus we had in the MPI was cooperation. Okay, is this one of these things that makes us uniquely human? And how does it develop within children? How does it change between apes and children? So we were looking at all these skills in different timelines. So that's what developmental psychology really is, beyond looking at children.
So in some ways, it sounds like it's almost like a philosophical inquiry in addition to being scientific, because we answer the questions of, okay, so what makes us what we are? That's fascinating. And you mentioned earlier that you've worked at a research laboratory which was also comparative, which, just for the audience who may not know what that means, it's, from my understanding, it's related to... it's got different. You research different species as well. So you research chimpanzees, was it?
Yes, great apes like chimpanzees, orangutans, bonobos. Great apes in general are closest living relatives.
Yes, yes. And so then by understanding the differences between a chimp brain or a chimp and its brain and what a human is capable of doing, then you kind of get a sense of, oh, this is what we've developed. This is important for humans. Is that right?
Yes,
Fascinating.
something similar to
So
that.
I'm curious, kind of following that thread, what are the big insights that you found that is different between chimps and lower apes and humans?
I mean, I didn't do any chimp work, so I
Mm-hmm.
didn't do any comparative work. Being exposed to that kind of research, all of my colleagues and friends were working, with great apes. That kind of informed the kinds of questions I asked, meaning that, okay, why does it matter? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is the evolutionary function of the skill that we're looking at?
Yeah.
So,
Like cooperation.
so why do we have this skill to begin with? Why do we care
Mm-hmm.
about cooperation?
Yeah.
Or why do we care about collective decision making?
Mm-hmm.
Or what is the evolutionary function of this? So that kind of informed the kinds of questions I asked, even if
Yeah.
I'm exclusively working with children.
Yeah. So what were you most curious to understand in the research you've done there?
Yeah, so I started as I was interested in language development, and clearly, language is one of the things that makes us, that make us
Yeah.
uniquely human. But then I was more interested in sort of collective problem solving or collaborative problem solving. How two children put their heads together. It's a form of cooperation, I guess. How two kids put their heads together to solve problems. Do
Yeah.
they prefer doing that with a person or without or without a partner? Do they make better decisions when they're doing it with a partner versus without a partner? Does it depend on the kind of partner, or does it depend on the kind of problems they're solving? So those are the kinds of things I started asking. And obviously language is a big part of it, because I need to share my reasoning with my partner. So if you and
That's
I
right.
are trying to solve a problem together, and imagine you and I are disagreeing.
Yeah.
Right? But we need to agree on something. We need to solve this problem. And I need to explain to you what my reasoning is.
That's right,
And you need to explain to me what your reasoning is. And then we go with the proposal supported by better set of reasons. So that's exchange of reasons, or exchange of my perspective contrasting yours. So it involves a bunch of skills, actually. It involves language. It involves perspective taking. It involves understanding someone's reasoning, my own reasoning, and also reflecting on, the contrast of these perspectives. So it's not just me understanding your perspective and you understanding my perspective, but we're just kind of collectively evaluating it in two perspectives in relation to one another, if it makes any sense.
That does make sense, yeah.
Yeah, so that's my current research program, actually. So I'm looking at children's reasoning in the sense of, explaining our perspectives or our reasons for our beliefs to one another, and how we sort of agree on a solution to a problem we're working together.
So I'm curious, in that area, what are some insights or questions that you've been trying to get more and more of an understanding of?
So far, my past research actually has shown that, when you put children in a collaborative context or a collaborative problem-solving context, or if you observe them in a cooperative context or a context of trust, they tend to perform better than when they're working on the same problem individually.
I see.
So my past research has kind of shown that, when children are are motivated to find the optimal solution to a problem that would benefit everyone involved.
Yeah.
They're more motivated to hear someone else's perspective, and they're able to criticize their own perspective. So this kind of context of trust elicits better kind of perspective taking, better kind of problem solving, better kind of reasoning, if you will.
Oh, that's interesting.
And right now, my current program involves, so one of the big questions, not just with human populations, but lots of different populations, is, do collectives make better decisions than individuals, right? On the one hand, we think yes, because, when you're reasoning with someone, especially if you're disagreeing with that person, you tend to catch one another's mistakes or cancel each other's biases and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, we know how collectives can make terrible decisions, right? So especially if you tend to reason with people who agree with you in these echo chambers, your views become more polarized.
I see.
So, but there are some studies showing that, yes, collectives make better decisions. Some studies show the opposite pattern. So And my current research program investigates, okay, children are a special population because they can actually benefit from this collective reasoning or collective decision making, especially because this kind of collective reasoning or collaborative problem solving provides them a context to learn new information, to appreciate different perspectives. So if any population, population of young children, they are the ones who would benefit mostly from this kind of collective decision making.
I see.
So currently we're looking at, okay, but what kinds of contexts, should we investigate or observe young children?
Yeah.
But most importantly, having experienced that kind of collective problem solving, would that improve their later subsequent individual reasoning? Does that collective reasoning work as a learning environment for them is what we're trying to sort of investigate currently.
Understood. Yeah. So tell me if I've understood you correctly. In some sense, you're trying to get at in what conditions, in what environments children learn the best, and you have a hypothesis that to a large extent, a group environment where they're working with other people may be an influence on that. But I'm curious to also know, have you gotten any insights as to which direction it's going in? So is it better or is it worse in some cases?
So it's too soon to say anything because the studies are ongoing. But what we found, so we tried with adults first, before we run anything with children, we use the adult pilot.
I see.
What we found was that collectives don't necessarily make better decisions than individuals.
I see.
But the experience of going through these problems with a partner does influence their later individual performance. Meaning that, so there was a collective group who solved problems with a partner and then individually. Yeah. And there was a solo group who solved the problems throughout individually. Right?
I see.
And we compared the individual performance at the end. And those who had the experience of solving this problem with a partner, they tend to do later in the individual trials, if that makes any sense.
I see. So in some sense, they've adopted their strategies for solving the problems.
Collectives may not necessarily make the better decisions, but the experience makes something click in individual minds that influences their later individual reasoning.
That's
for
interesting.
instance, just to give you an example, let's say I have certain biases about something and you disagree with me and we are partners, we have to agree on a solution and you give me a different perspective that sticks with me. Later on, when I'm solving a similar problem on my own, I can say, oh, Hugo mentioned this. Can this apply to this problem? Because we tend to give them similar problems. So they're basically, even if they don't necessarily make better decisions as collectives compared to solo, but their later individual performance improves compared to, yes.
Understood. So in some sense, not only is it different, but it's better. So it's better to have another person kind of challenging your viewpoint.
Exactly. It's not the outcome, but more the process that matters.
I see. Interesting.
What the adult data shows. So we're trying to sort of investigate that with children to see if it works the same way with children or not.
Yeah. One piece of research which seems to be related, which I was reading, and I think it was done by you and Michael Tomasello, was there was those little sticker-like characters. I think there were green frogs or something like green and red separation. The children had to separate them out. And at different ages, they were given different instructions. So 3-year-old and 5-year-old. Where they were given different instructions. Yes. And that seems to be very related to that, right?
Yes, in a way. That study was more about children's understanding of rules and norms. So we didn't quite... it is kind of similar in the sense that children have different perspectives and they have to come to an agreement. And they did give reasons. They explained their reasoning. But because it was like us telling them different rules, so they couldn't go too far. But it was basically like they were able to understand someone's perspective in the sense that older children say, okay, what you're suggesting is a plausible alternative. I'm happy to go with that.
Yeah.
Whereas younger children, what we found was that they were a bit more strict when it comes to rules, and they were not as flexible as older children. That was the kind of the take-home message of that paper. So it was more about norm enforcement between children. But maybe for the audience, I can clarify the study a little bit further. So we gave them a sorting task, and there were two ways to sort the cards or the magnets. So you could sort them by color, so blue ones go there, red ones go there, or you can sort them by shape. I don't remember, like circles go there, squares go there.
Yeah.
So one child learned the shape rule, the other child learned the color rule, and we put them together. So whichever went first, let's say they were sorting by color, it was a mistake from the perspective of the other child. So we wanted to see how they would respond and whether they would enforce norms on their partner, and how fast they would resolve this conflict. And what we found was that older children resolved this disagreement a bit faster, simply because they could appreciate that rules can be changed. We create the rules after all.
Yeah.
And what my partner is suggesting makes sense.
Yeah.
So why not? Whereas younger children, they were like, yes, no. It's like it went on forever and much longer. And most of the time, they didn't even agree with each other. So.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I wonder whether these kinds of developmental abilities would also influence group decision-making and group, like the benefits you derive from a group. Because as you mentioned, the younger children could not agree on things. And I can kind of imagine older people also having the same, the kind of fixed ideas and completely disagreeing with one another and not being able to come to any consensus because of it. So I'm sure there's some connections to older people as well. But when you have these developmental boundaries that children progress through, surely it has to affect it differently at different ages. So maybe in one case, a child would be affected by group and would benefit from it in their own decision-making process, but maybe at some point they wouldn't?
I mean, yeah, that's an empirical question. And we're kind of, another line of my current research focuses on this specific issue on disagreement.
Yeah.
And we're trying to see, like, what kind of disagreement would be more tolerated or even appreciated or even welcome.
Yeah.
And at what age.
I see.
So, for instance, we're trying to investigate, I don't know, like imagine someone you're disagreeing with, but on really fundamental issues. For instance, like we're trying to make a moral judgment.
Yeah.
And then you say, I propose something, and then you say, well, but then innocent people will get hurt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if I respond to that, so what? Like, we need to agree on certain fundamental things before our reasoning can continue.
Yeah.
But if it's a minor disagreement, then I might even benefit from your disagreeing perspective. But if that disagreement comes from someone who says something that really conflicts with my fundamental beliefs that innocent people should not be hurt, right? We need to agree on those kinds of things. Then any disagreement after that point, I may not even take into account.
Yeah. So that's something that really fascinated me when we were taking the developmental psychology last term. The development of children's morality seems to go from this more psychopathic almost approach where things are just conditionally, if you help me, then I help you. It doesn't feel. If you help me, then I help you, and this kind of almost like a tribal attitude, and more towards there are some fundamental ideas that we cannot move past. And so I'm curious whether these kinds of explorations, like of morality, in this case you also mentioned cooperation, and there's a lot of other subjects that were covered in your lab. I'm curious whether that gives you more insight into how people generally what those things are. So what is morality?
Yeah.
What is it supposed to do for us?
Yeah, I think Jean Piaget has an amazing quote that I use in my lectures all the time. Like they say, or he says that the best way to understand how institutions are formed in like larger societies, the best way to understand those is just to look at children's games, because
Interesting.
they represent a small version of this world in their games, like how
Yeah.
they create norms in their peer groups or how they enforce norms on people who break these norms
Yeah.
or violate these norms.
So one thing which I find really fascinating, and I'm curious um, if you also had this idea when you're doing research, is that each generation, so each child that is born and then grows up,
Mhm.
kind of gets to develop their own culture. And when I look at the past and when I look at the 19th century, 18th century, just into the past, what strikes me as ridiculous is how different things were such a short time ago. So even 100 years ago, we were horribly prejudiced on average, people were horribly prejudiced in whatever country you'd go in, and now things are changing quite rapidly. And so I'm curious if this kind of flexibility, people's flexibility, could be attributed to the fact that children kind of grow up alongside one another. So each generation gets to create their own culture, so to speak, and recreate it. I'm curious if you've kind of had these kinds of thoughts or not.
Um, I mean, yes. I mean, for instance, like we don't need to go that far back in time. Like even
Yeah.
COVID times, imagine like
Right.
everything
Yeah.
moved
Of
to
course.
sort of like online communication and all that, so children were less together with their peers.
Yeah.
So we shall see what the impact of those experiences are
Yeah.
or is on children's development. But yeah, I think it definitely the environment in which children are together
Yeah.
matters. There are different cultures and different views on peer interactions as well.
Yeah.
So there's certainly some cross-cultural differences in the way children experience peer interactions
Yeah.
and how they form their peer cultures.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And with that, kind of pivoting back to what you said about cooperation, I'm curious whether there's other research that you've also done in the past, because right now you're working on, as you mentioned, whether groups uh, kind of come to different decisions, and does the process of thinking change if you work in a group as a
Mhm.
child. Is there other research that you've done at the University of Manchester recently?
Um, I mean, not sort of. We worked on moral reasoning. Like
Uh
we
huh.
worked on sort of how children evaluate apologies, because that's one way of
Apologies. Ah,
apologizing.
interesting.
Like what counts as a good apology? What counts as a
Oh,
sincere apology?
that's interesting.
And one,
I'd like to know.
and one, for instance, saying "I'm sorry" is not enough. Like
Yeah.
because children often think, just if you say sorry, then you get a pass. You're
Yeah. Yeah.
excused.
Yeah.
But we show that it's not that simple. Actually, sometimes you need to say more than saying sorry, like how it
Yeah.
happened, why it happened. Like you need to give me more information, and that's work I have been doing with my former PhD student who is now a postdoc, Owen Waddington. He worked on apology, so he's the expert.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. Uh, and that seems to relate to a big idea in developmental psychology, as far as I understand, which is you're trying to understand what's going on internally, and if people can understand these intentions, if there's an
Mm-hmm.
intention
Mm-hmm.
behind the act. So if you just say I'm sorry, but you get the sense, oh, he didn't really mean it, then of course it
Yeah.
doesn't really affect you, doesn't count.
Yeah. I
Uh,
mean,
yeah.
there are some cases in which, for instance, if it's clear to you that I accidentally, let's say, broke your cup,
Yeah.
right? If you saw that it was an accident and you saw I was mortified, for instance, I said something like
Yeah.
that, and then saying I'm sorry can be enough because you saw how it happened, you saw I didn't mean to break your cup,
Yeah.
etc. But imagine I don't know, just broke your cup and it looked
Yeah.
intentional.
Yeah.
I didn't express any sort of, I didn't do any
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something like that. Um, but maybe I just broke it thinking that it was mine. That's yours, right? So there's like we call these belief-based accidents, because so I meant to break the cup, but I didn't mean to break your cup.
Yeah.
I thought it was mine, so I had a false belief about it. But from your perspective, it looks like I'm intentionally breaking your cup.
Yeah.
But from my perspective, it was an accident because I didn't realize it was yours.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then saying I'm sorry would not be enough.
Mm.
You say, what do you mean you're sorry? You just broke my cup.
Yeah.
And then I say, I need to say, I'm sorry. I thought it was my cup.
Mm-hmm.
So giving that extra piece of information helps you sort of conceptualize this act as an accident and not a sort of intentional violation of
exactly.
social norms. Yeah.
That's interesting. I know that this may be a little bit outside of your research interest, but I wonder if the internet and how we communicate via the internet has changed how we interpret exactly this kind of exchange, where someone violated your expectation of how one person should act, but maybe they did it with a completely positive intention, and they thought, given the context I'm in, it makes sense. But then because there's this gap of understanding, we don't have the viscera of seeing another person and talking to them, those misunderstandings kind of multiply. And it seems like the things that we typically would agree on in the end seem like fundamental disagreements.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that kind of taps into what you were saying just now, but
If you could
when
put the
we're
mic a little bit lower. Yeah, perfect.
When we're in the same room, for instance, it's easier for me to track what you witnessed or how you interpret my actions, because I can see like which direction you're looking at. Or I can see that you saw me like being, I'm so sorry. Whereas if we're, I don't know, talking through Zoom or something, or like a sort of online platform, it's harder to keep track of what your partner is monitoring or tracking. So that kind of leads to more disagreements, as you say, because it's hard for me to realize, well, did he really see me doing this, or did he really see that this was an accident? So it's harder to track that kind of thing. So then the misunderstanding can get bigger in that respect. But beyond that, I don't know much more about that.
No, that's not a problem. I even thought about it recently. I've had a text interaction with one of my friends, and I've been writing to them, trying to explain. In my case, we're working on a programming project together, building an application, and I told him what I wanted. Then he told me what he wanted, and I thought, wait, something's not right about what he messaged me. And so there was these disagreements over text, which I found real difficulty clarifying and explaining to him. And then we went in person. We met in person on last Tuesday, and it was just immediately clear as to what we were trying to convey. So there is this like multimodal understanding that comes from just being with another person. And if I remember correctly, there was some research on how groups online function, how effective they are versus groups in person. And I think it was much worse. So the effects were much worse for groups that were online, because there's this lack of mutual understanding that people have, and I suppose less loyalty as well, because you can just kind of turn yourself off, right?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that study. Like, but the online bits, were they able to talk to each other, or they were just typing?
I think they were talking to each other.
Talking to each other.
Yeah. So it was like a Zoom-like study.
Interesting.
Okay.
So maybe I have no idea, but I'm just speculating. So maybe they're sort of less willing to talk.
Yeah.
When you're in person, it's a bit easier just to talk. Maybe, like you said, disagreements can get escalated for various reasons, because it's just the common ground is not established as well as in person.
Yeah, so there's another topic that we've covered in our developmental psychology class, which I found really fascinating. I think it was probably my favorite. It was the theory of mind idea. And I loved it personally because I thought it was so key in how we understand other people, not only as children, but as we age, and understanding their intentions, understanding their kind of internal things, that their internal beliefs was something that I found really thrilling. And so I know that you've done some research into that as well.
Right.
So I'd be curious to know a little bit more about when you've been exploring theory of mind. What were the kinds of, I suppose, the philosophical uh, approaches that you had to go in with,
Mm-hmm.
and have they been challenged at all? Just give me a
Um,
moment, Ella. Come on.
oh yeah. So one thing we did recently was we investigated. So the theory of mind is so the classic task to measure children's theory of mind is sort of these change of location tasks or Sally Ann tasks. I don't know if you remember any of those. So basically, one person puts their chocolate in one location.
Yeah.
And they leave the room. Their mom comes into the room, change the location of the chocolate, and the mom leaves. And
Yeah.
then the child comes back. And the classic test is, okay, where will he look for the chocolate?
Yeah.
And as you know, children of 3 years of age, they just don't understand that someone can have a
Exactly.
false belief, and
Yeah.
they say, well, he will look for the chocolate where it actually is. So that classic false belief tasks have been challenged or criticized for many, many years. But recently what we did was, so we put children in a collaborative problem-solving context, meaning that if their partner has a false belief, their actions would have some kind of consequences for the child. For instance, that they would look for the law if they understand anything about false belief, right? So if their partner has a false belief and they act in line with their false belief, for instance, they're looking for a toy, but they have a false belief about the location of that toy, so they would basically look for an empty location and they would miss it.
Yeah.
So they would fail.
Yeah.
And that means the child would fail too because we are partners.
I see.
So we basically sort of created or modified this classic task and made it a collaborative task, collaborative problem-solving task, in which the child is involved in the scenario rather than sort of listening to a third-person story or just observing a story. So the child is actually involved.
Yeah.
And they need to track whether their partner has a false belief or not, because the partner will look for the toy. And if they cannot find the toy, that means they're going to miss the reward as well.
Of course, yeah.
So when you place the child in this collaborative problem-solving context, what we found was that, yes, they were more motivated to track their partner's belief states. Does their partner have a false belief? Does their partner have a true belief?
Yeah.
And can we rely on what they're about to do? And if they have a false belief, do they actually intervene? Like they say, hey, stop, it's not there.
Yeah.
Kind of. So what we found was that they were more motivated and they were able to track their partner's belief states or evaluate whether their beliefs were false or true.
Did it also happen at a younger age than typically is expected of theory of mind, like 3 to 5?
3.
Okay.
3. So classic theory of mind tasks, children at age 3, they don't really it's not that they are confused or anything, right? They are consistently giving the wrong answer. That's the idea. Whereas in this case, we showed that 3-year-olds, when observed in a collaborative context, they were able to take the perspective of their partners. And again, I'm mumbling, but it's not just taking the perspective of another person. It's just, appreciating 2 perspectives at the same time. Their perspective, my perspective, and maybe a third objective perspective. Yeah.
So it's almost like holding 2 different ideas in mind
or multiple
at the same time.
perspectives in mind, in fact. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm curious if you've gotten any understanding of more of the neuroscience side of it, because there is a whole area which is trying to understand how is it that we can hold different ideas in mind at the same time. And I'm curious whether it's more when we think of children, of course they have some developmental I wouldn't say deficiencies, but they haven't developed yet in certain areas. Like they have their prefrontal cortices are less myelinated and so on and so forth. So there's a few things that are a little bit different than adults. And there's also the question of a lack of experience. They literally have fewer experiences interacting with other people, working in groups, etc. And so I'm curious if you've explored the difference between those two and whether one of them appears to be more important. So say having more experience let's say if you have siblings, then maybe you'd be able to develop theory of mind earlier, versus it's just a fixed, well-known timeline that it progresses at this age.
I haven't done any research on that, or
Okay.
sadly, I don't do any neuroscience or like brain imaging,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. But there are some studies I'm aware of that, and I don't know much about sort of brain,
That's fine.
but there are some studies that show that, for instance, you know, children who have siblings, they tend to pass false belief tasks a little earlier. There are some studies suggesting that those children who engage in pretend play, perhaps you remember from that lecture
I
too,
do.
they might pass false belief tasks a little bit earlier. Some studies show that bilingual children pass false belief tasks a little bit earlier. But these are, it's some studies show that, some studies don't. So I would say the evidence is mixed at the moment.
Gotcha.
And mostly because, like, imagine like bilingualism or having a sibling or not.
Yeah.
You have very little experimental control there. So it's
Of course.
basically, then the conclusions are a little bit limited.
So it's mostly correlational.
Correlational. Most of them are correlational. Most of them, we don't have the golden rule of random assignment. We cannot just assign families to, okay, you can have one child and you can have more than one
Yes.
child. We cannot tell ethically that kind of. So we have less experimental power, which means that we cannot really say much more. So I'm aware of different findings, but I've never done research on those topics myself. Yeah.
Understood. And so, pivoting a little bit, I'm curious if there are some areas of developmental psychology which you think are currently really hot. So there's a lot of things happening there, and you really want to know more about it, but maybe there's still a little bit of uncertainty as to them.
I think the current maybe it's just I'm interested in that, and I'm sort of thinking of it as the hot topic at the moment. But there's a sort of greater emphasis, and I love it, on cross-cultural research, representing different perspectives, or children speaking different languages, growing up different cultures. So we tend to assume, like 95 or 99% of the literature comes from this weird cultures, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Democratic, yeah. There you go. We got there.
But though 99% of the literature represent that population, but that population is actually a very small fraction of the entire child population of the world. So we're making these like bold generalizations based on this limited sort of small population. So right now there's this more push and more emphasis and more interest on exploring more diverse populations, which I'm loving. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I'm curious if that kind of research, whether you've seen any ideas we've had about children and we've had about different developmental timelines that were challenged as a result of these kinds of cross-cultural
and
studies.
also I think sort of doing cross-cultural or cross-linguistic even research is not always about finding differences. You can establish some universals too, like if so in one of the papers which is currently under review, we looked at children's gaze following.
Okay.
It's one of the most important sort of skill in developing, like learning languages or communicating, or like tracking what you're looking at and stuff like that. And we had 17 different cultures, so that was quite a representative in all continents. And that's like basically establishing a human universal.
Yeah, really.
So which was fascinating. So cross-cultural research is great identifying differences between the cultures, but it also helps us understand some of the human universals as well. So it can work both ways. Yeah.
Which to me is really the fascinating part of it, and also the surprising part of why we haven't done this earlier. That surely, if you want to find something universal, then you look at a universal sample, or a sample that's representative of a universal group. You wouldn't just look at this little subgroup that is measurably different from all the other subgroups, because then there's going to be this confounding effect of, well, if you're rich and you have a certain, I suppose different cultures have different proclivities, like different attitudes towards, let's say, collectivism versus individualism. So whether you think of yourself as a member of a group versus just an individual, then surely that's going to affect how you conceptualize things and how you may engage in group tasks, right? Like,
Yeah,
obviously.
absolutely.
So then having something that's more universal, so what exists regardless of culture, that would give us the strongest evidence. So I find that really fascinating. And one thing which you've mentioned is that you've done a study that's across, what was it? How many countries?
17
17. Yeah, that's crazy.
cultures.
17 cultures. How do you go about organizing, setting up such a study?
Yes, I was responsible for the Turkish sample because I'm from Turkey.
Yeah.
But the lead author, Manuel Bon, so he was in charge of basically sort of reaching out to different researchers and in the MPI Leipzig,
Yeah.
they have very sort of many field sites in South America,
I see.
East Asia, Africa. So they have established field sites. So that's why we could reach out to all
I
those
see.
different cultures, and then reaching out to weird children was a bit easier, I guess.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
Of course, that makes sense. So there was essentially an international collaboration thanks to the LPI.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So when you were kind of going back a little bit, when you mentioned that your family kind of encouraged you to get a PhD no matter what, they wanted you to have a PhD. Why did you decide to go to LPI in the first place?
MPI. So it was interesting because I did my PhD in the US, and then I wanted to do my postdoc in Europe, and in my PhD work I was more interested in language development, and Mike Tomasello was like one of the pioneers of language development as well, and he was in Germany. So I wrote to him and I said, do you have a postdoc position? And so luckily he accepted me, and then I went to MPI. But then sort of Mike pushed me in the direction of sort of not necessarily hardcore language acquisition, but more about how we use language for cooperation or for problem solving. So that's how my current research program was kind of formed 10 years ago or so, or 15 years ago. So then he put me he directed me a little bit towards this cooperation, collaborative problem solving context. And I still sort of I look at how children use language to do all those things.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So you mentioned earlier that language is kind of foundational to everything that we do. And obviously, even seeing this podcast, you can see that there's some kind of something unique to humans. There's no chimpanzees with microphones and headphones on. And so I'm curious if there's been some insights in the area of language which you've gotten an understanding of as a result of your research.
Some of the interesting things we found was, and it's a little bit complicated to explain, but we found that the structure of the language a child speaks.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about culture or anything, but just purely the grammatical rules of a language can influence the way they can communicate certain information.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we, for instance, recently compared Turkish-speaking children to English-speaking children. And I don't want to talk too much about technical details.
Of course.
But Turkish has this evidential markers. So a simple past tense sentence, an English speaker would say, for instance, the child ate an apple. Right? There are two ways of saying this. So one way of saying is that the child ate an apple and I saw that.
Yeah.
Or the child ate an apple, I didn't see that. I'm either making an inference or I heard it from someone else. It's just something I did not see firsthand.
Yeah.
And then we wanted to see, does this give them an advantage when they're sort of trying to solve a problem together? For instance, the most common example we used to give in Germany, in Leipzig, MPI, was that imagine you and I are hunting and we have to stick together to be successful, right? And you say, look at the footprints. The gazelle must have gone this way. And I say, no, the gazelle went the other way because I saw it. So first-hand observation tops this indirect evidence of footprints, right?
Yeah.
So if a language forces you to make that distinction, whether you see something firsthand or not, does that sort of facilitate how, speakers to communicate the strength of their claims and be more convincing, perhaps, for their partners? So we observed children in like these kinds of situations where their partner disagreed with them, and all they have to say was, "But I saw that." And we saw that Turkish-speaking children was sort of making that kind of arguments or saying, "I saw that," more often than English-speaking children, and at an earlier age.
Oh, interesting.
So I think that was really interesting in the sense that it's not even, the culture or the way you interact with their peers. It's just not manners. It's not conventions. It's simply the grammatical rule of a language can influence your communication, your ability to solve certain problems.
Wow, that's interesting. So in some ways, in the language itself, you have built-in structures, tools, that either help you or hamper your ability to that's fine. That either help you or hamper your ability to solve a certain problem, which is really fascinating. There was a philosopher, I forgot his name, but I know he was at this university at some point, who said that language kind of shapes and constrains your ability to think. So I wonder if you have a multilingual environment or you are multilingual, then that gives you access to different kinds of insights than you would as a person who just knows one language.
Yeah, I mean, that's some future directions. And I'm sure lots of people are working on that already, like how multilingualism or being able to speak multiple languages, would that facilitate? And I think there's some research to show that, they're sort of multilingual children. They are able to take the perspective of their partners a little bit better than...
That's interesting. Oh, that's really fascinating.
Monolingual children. But again, it's there are different results. I don't want to say too much about that because I don't
Fair enough. Of
not
course,
my research.
Let's focus on the things we're an expert at, right? Completely understand that. So one more thing. I'm curious whether, kind of looking back at your experience so far in research, whether there's some kinds of insights that you'd have for an aspiring researcher, for someone who wants to get into this area, whether that's developmental psychology or psychology more broadly, and whether there's something that you think now is really important that you wish you knew when you were younger.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm going to sound very old, but things have changed so much. Like, you guys have so much things available to you that I didn't have when I was at your age. And like for instance, when I was a student, even accessing papers was a big issue. Now there's another great push for open access publications so that everything is accessible to more people. There's this push for transparency, like you can access the R scripts or statistical scripts of researchers, so you can see those things behind the scenes kind of things. Or there's all these now YouTube clips and researchers presenting their work and showing some examples. So many resources available, and I think that's amazing. So my recommendation to aspiring researchers, I think, is to definitely read. But now you have different forms, like you can access to lots of information very quickly, and I think the best way to sort of just whatever makes you interested. It's just, otherwise it would be too lonely or too boring. So I think imagine. By reading or exploring, you might be able to find out what you're passionate about. I know it's going to sound a bit lame and not very new.
No.
But I think with the resources available to you guys, I think it's it feels somehow a bit easier to find out what you're passionate about.
I believe so, yeah.
Especially you can make a more informed decision because you can see so many different things at the same time.
That's right, yeah. I can definitely empathize with that. Now on YouTube, for instance, there's just a channel that's basically for everyone and anyone. There could be something in chemistry, physics,
Or
anyway.
cooking even.
Yeah,
Like, yeah,
clearly,
yeah.
clearly. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bahar Koymen. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was fun.
It was really fun. I hope to do this again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.